Let's call it reset camera. Cool. So that's done. And right away, it's available in Blueprint. There's no recompiling to do. That's already available. We just need to bind some actions to it. Right? So for now, let's use, I don't know, I'm going to use the R. Oops. I'm going to use the R key on my keyboard. So if you go to the keyboard section here and scroll down, you can choose any key. Doesn't matter. I'm going to use R. You're not limited to just one input. You can have as many input as you want here. You could use as many keys as you want. And you can also combine a bunch of keys together. So, I could do Control R if I take that, or Control Alt, or, anything like that. For now, I'm just going to leave it to R. And that's it. We don't have to save or anything. Close the project settings. And if you go back to your third-person character blueprint, go somewhere empty, and just right-click, add event. Where'd that go? Actually, don't know which category, because I always search. You can search for it. You can search for input, and what did we call it? Reset camera, right? So it's here. It's actually in the input category. So if you don't want to search, you can just scroll down to input, action events, and that will be in there, reset camera. So you see how quick that was. We've just set a new setting in the project settings, and instantly that was available and now we can just use it. So all we need to do now that we have this event, we need to connect this to something. To reset the camera is a little bit, it's not complicated, but it might not make sense right away. Just trust me on that one, and it will make a bit more sense once we start looking at the gameplay framework a bit later. All you need to do is right click and search for get player controller. I'll explain in a few slides what the player controller is, but for now, just get the controller and then drag the data output and select set control rotation. This one here. All right. So now connect the execution flow from pressed to the input. The new rotation here. Remember when we made that example of the random, we used the make to make a rotation. So we could use that here as well, and that would allow us to make a new rotation. But it's actually a trick to avoid having an extra node on your graph. You can just right click that input here, and you can choose split struct pin, and that would actually split it in the node itself. And then you can manually edit values here or even connect stuff to it. In our case, all we want to do is set the Z rotation, the yaw, to be 90 degrees. That's all we need, 0, 0, T. And that's basically it. Now compile that and then do a play from here. So you see that I'm rotating my camera, no problem. As soon as I press the R key, my camera resets behind the player. Yep, I can repeat for sure. So let's get back to it. What was I doing? Oh yeah. So we want to reset the camera, right? So the camera is reset by getting the player controller. Once again, don't worry too much if you don't understand what the player controller is. Doesn't matter for now. And then you call the set control rotation function from the player controller. All right, connect that. And so you see there's a new rotation data input here. So there's a bunch of different ways to set that. You could make a variable of type rotation here. I can click variable and I can change the type to be rotator. That's a rotation, right? And then you can see in the property of my variable, I can type the values for that rotation. So I could type this to 90 because that's the rotation I'm looking at for the camera. For the camera to be behind the player, it needs to have 0, 0, and 90 in Z. Don't worry too much about these values. I just found out by playing around with it, right? So to set it, I could get that variable here and connect that to the new rotation, right? And you can see the error goes away, and it's going to set the rotation to 0, 0, 90, because that's what my variable is set to. But if you didn't want to use a variable just for that, then you could do two things. You could drag the data input and use a make rotator, the same way we've done in the random light example, right? And the make rotator gives you a node that splits that rotator into 3 floats. And here I could set my Z to 90, and this would work. But it's a bit annoying because it adds an extra node. Right? You get nodes everywhere. So the third thing you can use to set the rotation is just right-click the input pin, right-click it, and you select split struct pin. And what that does, you can see it separates that rotation into 3 floats in the node itself. And then you can set the Z to 90. And that should do what we want. Hopefully. And if I press R, oh, what happened?
So I've figured out that when it sets it to 90, it's 90 relative to the world, not relative to the character.
Ah, you're right. Okay, so my example is a bit crap, but you get the idea. To be able to set it relative to character, we'd have to do a little math and blueprints and rotation conversion. Yeah, but we don't really have the time right now, so I'm just going to move forward. Any other question?
I have, but I'll message you in like 10 minutes, if you're okay with it.
Sorry, what? Say again?
I have a lot of questions, but I will message you later in 10 minutes.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
All right, next we're going to look at the gameplay framework. So gameplay framework, I think I mentioned it at the start of the lecture. The gameplay framework is a bunch of classes that are already built in Unreal, and they come with the engine no matter what kind of project you start, no matter what template you use, these classes will be available for you. And this is where Unreal is a bit easier to start making a game with, I guess, than other alternatives. Is because that framework here is already built in. You don't need to build your own controller for a player. You don't need to build your own controller for an AI. You don't need to build your own system to manage cameras. You don't need to build a game mode or like a pawn controller. All of that stuff is already in the engine. And I'm always surprised at the amount of people that do not use and instead start making their own, and eventually they end up writing the exact same thing. And so they've wasted that whole time when they could have just used that. Something to keep in mind, though, is that they're a base to start with. Most of them, you're not actually supposed to just use them as is. You're supposed to use them as a base class and extend from it, make a child, and then customize your own class to fit with the type of game you're making. But this gives you like an awesome head start for everything that's like very basic gameplay, game mechanics. So what you have available is, talk about that. It mostly all comes from object and we've already looked at. And actor, like we talked about, gives you the ability of having to transform in the world. But then you have all these classes. The HUD is basically the ability to have a on-screen UI, to show your HP, your score, stuff. The camera manager takes care of like switching between different active cameras. If let's say you have different players that you can switch from a player to another player, then the camera manager will automatically switch the camera. Or if you go from the player camera to a cinematic camera, that's also automatically handled by the camera manager. The game mode is where all the rules of the game are defined. The game, how to play the game, all that stuff, the score. Pawn is basically the physical representation of either a player or an AI. Character is a child class of pawn because character is more humanoid kind of pawn. as in it has a skeleton, it animation and mesh, where the pawn could just be like a ball, anything. And a pawn is always possessed, controlled by a controller. The controller basically takes care of translating the player's input and relaying that to the pawn, and the pawn then decides what to do with it. The controller can either be a player controller or an AI controller. So that's kind of like the nice thing with this. You could make a pawn, with your main character, let's say. That pawn has animation, it can jump, it can do stuff. You could have, if you've played Left 4 Dead, for example, you could have the game start where the character is controlled by the player at first. But at some point, an AI controller takes control of your character. And then the player doesn't control it anymore. It's controlled by AI. The player can take control of it later on. If you're making like a strategy game, for example, like an RTS, this is where this is really useful, because you can have a pawn and the player can actually control a bunch of pawns and tell them where to go. So this is kind of more or less the basics. The game mode itself is kind of like the start point, because the game mode, once you make your own custom game mode, you'll be able to open it up and define what the base classes, what the default classes are for each of these gameplay framework components. So you can have your own kind of like HUD, you can have your own pawn, you can have your own controller. This is where you define which class is going to be used for which function. I've talked about that a bit already, but yeah, the pawn, the controllers possess pawn, and the pawn gets possessed by a controller. The player controller kind of contains and manages the HUD, the input system, and the camera as well. And a player controller actually joins a game which contains a game mode. There's a bunch more classes. If you look here in the properties, there's quite a lot more